I always love it when people raise an eyebrow and say, of course, there's a lot that didn't come out in court. There's always a lot that didn't come out in court. In an adversary system, each party only brings up the evidence that makes it look good. Evidence that doesn't make either side look good tends to remain unseen. There's a lot of things people aren't able to find out about. Rules of evidence and constitutional provisions keep very useful facts from coming in, especially in criminal trials. There are also usually a lot of accusations and allegations that just aren't solid enough to be brought out in court, stuff that's just not ready for prime time. Perhaps there's more than usual of all this in the Hiss case. Well, the major source of what didn't come out in court is papers from the files of the U.S. government that were produced starting in the 70s under the Freedom of Information Act. And the government's FOIA papers, like the dog that did not bark in the Sherlock Holmes story, are significant for what they do not show. There is no trace of any conspiracy to frame Hiss. On the contrary, the FOIA documents show that in 1948, the tentacles of the governmental octopus, far from entwining Hiss with diabolical efficiency, are swinging wildly and stinging each other. And anybody who's worked for the government will tell you, including me, this is how we function most of the time. The papers lay bare bureaucratic brawls about control of the case and possession of Chambers' documents and the films and whom to indict. When Chambers produced the typed and handwritten documents of the deposition, the top people in the Justice Department wanted Chambers to be indicted. Nixon criticized the FBI early in the HUAC hearings, and Hoover conceived an intense dislike of the young congressman. Nixon and Hoover were not working together. Hoover spent most of his energy during this case defending himself against accusations that he'd missed, that he'd sort of written off Chambers wrongly in 1942, accusations by Nixon and the Attorney General and the Secretary of State. Hoover himself wanted Chambers and Hiss indicted. HUAC, in the weeks before Chambers produced the spy documents, which is when any forgery would have to have occurred, was inactive, with a tiny staff that had other things to do. And really only in the last days of the grand jury did the Justice Department lawyers who were examining Hiss in the grand jury room get so angry at him that they swung against him. One person who comes out of the FOIA documents looking rather foolish is J. Edgar Hoover. He was not masterminding anything. He learned about a lot of what happened in this case by reading the newspapers. Chambers testified to HUAC, not to the FBI. Chambers gave the typewritten and handwritten documents to Hiss's lawyers, not the FBI. Chambers gave the pumpkin papers to HUAC, not to the FBI. And there were a lot of documents in Hoover's files with memos telling him what happened today, and his little handwritten stuff in the margin says, "Here again, I heard nothing of this for several days. I should have been advised at once, H." And my personal favorite, "What are the facts? Was there any pumpkin involved at all? H." I doubt these papers are a diabolically false trail of paper to cover up Hoover masterminding the frame-up of Hiss. I don't think Mr. Hoover was above creating fake paper in the appropriate case, but I don't think he's the kind of man who'd make fake paper that makes him look foolish. Hoover was a day late and a dollar short, and frankly almost comic throughout this affair. A final bunch of paper from the FBI files that tends to disprove any conspiracy to frame Hiss shows that when the FBI learned, in fact they learned, I think, from Clyde E. Catlett, that Ed McLean had found the Hiss home typewriter, or had found 23099, the FBI went into a tizzy. This case had been rough on the Bureau and the image-conscious Hoover, and it was the crowning humiliation when this white shoe corporate lawyer, Ed McLean, did what 26 FBI agents couldn't do. He found the typewriter, and the FBI's first reaction was to think that this was a fake typewriter created by the Hiss defense, or on a less skullduggerous level that Ed McLean, well-meaning amateur, had found a Woodstock, but not the Woodstock that everybody was looking for. So all of this, of course, shows the FBI just being a day late and a dollar short, and no masterminding of any conspiracy to frame Hiss. It also makes no sense to portray Chambers, I think, as Hiss did, as the perfect pawn of a conspiracy. I think that if you look at Chambers' life in the large and ask, What manner of man is this? The one word that does not come to mind is pawn. Whittaker Chambers did what he thought was the right thing to do at every time in his life, and to hell with the consequences, and boy, he paid the price that you pay when you live your life that way. On the ship of state, he was a loose cannon on deck. In the arsenal of democracy, he was an unguided missile. He was nobody's pawn. Now, Hiss's people waded through the FOIA documents and tried to establish that the prosecution had not played fair, and various documents showing alleged prosecutorial misconduct, not that Hiss was innocent, just showing supposed bad conduct by the prosecutor, was the subject of his last foray into court in '78. His motion was dismissed by a judge in 1982 who clearly thought it was frivolous. The second trial was a fair one by any standard. The Court of Appeals thought that Hiss's case was so weak it affirmed without a written opinion, and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. Hiss himself said of this effort, "We have no smoking gun here, just some stuff in the prosecution files that we wished we'd known in '49, most especially Chambers' confession of his gay acts." So here's Hiss saying, "I'm just seeking the truth," like a nice guy, and then saying, damn, if only I could have smeared him as a queer, I might have gotten away with it. Now, Hiss is right. I'll spare you the details on this, that the prosecution of him was not up to today's standards. But standards for criminal prosecutions and the rights of criminal defendants were much lower in the 1940s than they are today. They've risen a great deal. By today's standards, neither side in this case played fair. Both did some dirty tricks, some by today's standards, some by old standards even. But to show that the government did something in a long criminal investigation and trials in the 1940s that wouldn't be allowed today is really shooting fish in a barrel or taking candy from a baby. Despite keeping the case in court for decades, Hiss was not able to get one judge to vote his way on the merits. Now, the second new source of information on the case, and much more interesting, is the files of Hiss's lawyers. One thing that it revealed is that maybe the reason Mrs. Hiss was so nervous throughout the case was that her terrible secret might come out, and that was that between her marriages she'd gotten pregnant and had had an illegal abortion. This did not come out, and as far as I know, the government didn't know about it. Another tidbit from the Hiss defense files is that the defense retained a handwriting analyst who concluded that Chambers' handwriting showed, and I'm quoting, "marked narcissism, self-love, a drive to dominate his environment, extreme egocentricity, but there's no indication of a break with reality." And that's pretty close to my opinion of Chambers. A remarkable revelation from the Hiss files is that the Hiss family pediatrician saw Chambers in the Hiss home in January 1937, long after Hiss said, "We kicked them out of our lives." It's a rather bizarre scene. This is back when doctors made house calls. The doctor came to attend to Mrs. Hiss's son by her first marriage, and she rings the doorbell and comes in, "Hello, Alger, hello, Prosy." She goes up to see Timmy and then says goodbye. And when she gets back in her car, she realizes, I forgot my gloves. She goes back and rings the doorbell, and the door flies open, and there's a heavy-set, gruff man blocking her entrance, and he says, "You may not come in." And that man, she recognized a year later, was Whittaker Chambers. Do you remember William Rosen, who was the hapless little man whose name was used in the dummy transaction involving Hiss's 1929 Ford, the one with the sassy little trunk in the back? One day, March 9th, 1949, as Ed McLean was getting ready for the trial, he was visited by a lawyer named Emanuel Block, who later unsuccessfully defended the Rosenbergs. And Mr. Block told Mr. McLean, let me tell you what I know about this Ford thing. He said that the transaction with the Ford had involved a very high communist whose name would be a sensation in this case, and that the man who ultimately got the Ford is a communist. In other words, Mr. McLean, don't look too hard into what happened to that Ford. Incidentally, the historian Gary Wills writes that another lawyer who represented Rosen, a man named Maurice Braverman, wound up in the same prison with Hiss for reasons having nothing to do with the Hiss case. And he approached Hiss and said, "I used to be Mr. Rosen's lawyer." And Hiss said, "Yes, I know," and never asked him about the Ford. And you know, if I were in prison and my life had been ruined because I'd been framed and part of the frame-up involved something about a car, and somebody came up to me in prison and said, I know all about the car, I would not let that guy go until I had pumped him for everything he knew, but Hiss just walked away. So. Another revelation I find particularly fascinating concerns Hiss's mental condition. In addition to Dr. Binger, there was a psychologist at the Harvard Medical School, a Dr. Murray, who testified at the second trial that Chambers was a psychopath. And apparently, he either heard Hiss's testimony on the first day he was in the courtroom, or he read it, or something or other, and he sought out his lawyer, his trial lawyer, Claude Cross, and said, I gather from Mr. Hiss's testimony that he suffers from a self-image in which he really believes that he's never done anything wrong in his life, and he's never even made a mistake in his life. And he said to Claude Cross, this is not true, you know, nobody's that perfect, and second, you know, juries hate witnesses like this, and you have to do something to make him human or you might lose this case. And that Claude Cross went to Hiss and said, tomorrow let me ask you about some things that you've done that haven't turned out perfectly. And Hiss insisted that his testimony about his life consist entirely of successes and triumphs. So maybe Hiss is the one who's out of touch with reality. And maybe he never believed. He believed he never was a communist by the end and all the rest. And maybe this explains his insistence on innocence. I don't know. More from the Hiss defense files. The Hiss defense retained 3 typewriter experts. None of them was called to testify at the trial because all of them separately came to conclusions harmful to Hiss. 2 of them concluded, just like Mr. Feehan of the FBI, that the Hiss standards and the spy documents were typed on the same typewriter. They went even further than Feehan and said that typewriter was 230099. The third did not disagree with that, but reached a different conclusion, but researched a different question, concluding that the spy documents were typed on 230099. One of Hiss's experts went even further and concluded that both sets of documents were typed by Priscilla Hiss. And another was inclined strongly in that direction. And if Priscilla Hiss typed the spy documents, it's very hard to think of a scenario in which Hiss is innocent. And if she typed the spy documents, does it really matter whether 230099 was the Hiss typewriter? I don't know. One Hiss expert even opined that certain handwriting in the spy documents, corrections and marginalia, resembled the handwriting of Alger Hiss. Another expert, not hired by the prosecution or the defense, it's a little unclear who hired him, either Time Magazine or HUAC, I think, reached the conclusion that the Hiss standards and the spy documents had been typed on the same typewriter, and this was a man named Ordway Hilton, who was apparently like God in the field of analyzing typewritten documents. So we have 5 independent experts dismissing the forgery by typewriter theory. In addition, 7 eyewitnesses identified 230099 as the Hiss home typewriter, and these were Alger Hiss, Priscilla Hiss, Claudie Catlett, her sons Raymond and Perry, the Black Night Watchman, Ira Lockey, and his daughter. And these are the people who lived under the same roof with it for like 18 years. And the Catlett Kids and Lockey's daughter's identifications particularly were based not on dents in the G, but on the typewriter's external appearance, that a certain thing had been chipped and a knob was missing, and something about the carriage return lever, I think, was wobbly, and certain keys stuck at the top when you typed them, and the ribbon didn't move smoothly. And how could the forger have known those things? You could know the dent in the G from a document typed on it, but in order to know to make the carriage return lever wobble and to pull off this wheel and chip that thing there, you'd need to have the actual typewriter to know how to alter your fake. And that then brings up the question of, well, if you had the real typewriter, why would you make a fake at all? Perhaps most explosively, the Hiss defense files show that the Hisses knew in late 1948 that the typewriter they'd had 10 years before was a Woodstock and that they'd given it to the Catlett Kids. They knew this when they were denying such knowledge under oath to the grand jury and remembering a slew of other typewriters, but the word Woodstock never passed their lips. And the Hisses, while pretending to cooperate with the FBI, concealed these crucial facts from the Bureau and even from their own lawyer, Edward McLean. Claudie Catlett and the Catlett Kids also concealed a lot of what they knew about the typewriter's history from the FBI. From the papers of Alger and Donald Hiss, Donald, Alger's younger brother, appears to have been sort of the chief of black operations for the Hiss defense. He engaged in investigations about the Woodstock, and he only shared the results with Hiss's A-team lawyers like Ed McLean if the results were favorable. It's worth making one other observation about forgeries by typewriter, especially the possibility of an after-dark switcheroo of the fake 23099 for the real Hiss typewriter in the night watchman's basement. Based on the documents from the FBI and the Hiss defense, the first people who knew where the Hiss home typewriter was, who knew it was in the night watchman's house, and who were in the position to pull a switcheroo, are Donald Hiss and the Catlett Kids, not the FBI. Now, a third source of information about the case that didn't come out in court is the private papers of, believe it or not, a female novelist associated with Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Josephine Herbst. She lived in Bucks County in 1934 with her husband, John Herman, and Herman knew Harold Ware. Remember the Ware group, the chat group? Herman was a member of the Communist Party. Josie was not. And Ware got Herman an agricultural job in the government in Washington, and against her better judgment, apparently she was a country girl, she joined her husband in the fall of 1934, and they moved into an apartment on New Hampshire Avenue. And the marriage didn't last very long. One thing she didn't like was that Herman was clearly engaged in taking home paper from the office, government paper, and passing it on to the Communist Party. And a person who was part of this operation came by their apartment from time to time. He was the guy who picked up the documents from Herman, and she remembered that he was a slovenly and rotund man who spoke with a vaguely Germanic accent and went by the name of Carl. And sometimes he dropped by when Herman wasn't there, and Josie and he would have a chat. And Carl was boastful and paranoid, but she said he also had a cherubic side and was literarily inclined and very articulate. Josephine Herbst also remembered her husband saying that Carl wanted to meet a young lawyer at the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, named Alger Hiss. And she also remembered her husband later saying that he had bought Carl and Hiss together at lunch at a Chinese restaurant in DuPont Circle. Well, late that fall, Josie left John and went back to Bucks County, and one of the reasons was that she thought that what Ware and Carl and John were doing was totally silly, busy work by overgrown children playing cops and robbers. And of course, 15 years later, she picks up the newspaper and there's a picture of Chambers, and she goes, "Oh, Carl." And he's spilling the beans. Mrs. Herbst talked with both the FBI and the Hiss defense, but was not called as a witness at the trials. And she said, or I guess what she could have said was, I have no idea what, if anything, these two men were doing in 1938, but I can place Hiss and Chambers in Soviet espionage in the fall of 1934. In the only biography of Josephine Herbst that I'm aware of, the author starts out the chapter about this part of her life by saying, "Dear reader, if your happiness depends on believing that Alger Hiss was innocent, this chapter is not for you." A fourth source of information that didn't come out in the trials is the files of the Czech and Hungarian secret police about Noel Field. This is the man who made Hetty Massing say to Hiss, "Whoever wins Noel, we're all working for the same man." When Field faded across the Iron Curtain in 1949, he first went to communist Czechoslovakia and then to Hungary, saying, "Please help me." The communist governments chloroformed him, put him in prison, and tortured him. That's gratitude. It seems they hadn't expected him and they weren't quite sure what side he was on. He was kept in prison for many years and was tortured into making false accusations against many communists, saying that they had been American agents working for him. And he was the star witness in a lot of purge trials that Stalin's local roadies put on in Hungary and other Soviet satellites to rid those countries of communists who hadn't been loyal to Stalin all along. and to some who had been. And all these statements by Field, of course, were false. Well, when Stalin died in '53, this lunacy ended and Field was soon released, and I think lived the rest of his life in great comfort in communist Hungary. But what was found in the secret police files was a handwritten statement dating from the end of his imprisonment, when the pressure to lie was off of him, and recollecting his doings in the '30s. And in one of the statements he made to the Hungarians, Field writes that in 1935, and I'm quoting, "Hiss wanted to recruit me for espionage for the Soviet Union. I carelessly told him that I was already working for the Soviet intelligence. I knew from what Hiss told me that he was already working for the Soviet Secret Service. I drew the conclusion that Chambers was Hiss's upper contact in the Secret Service too." And Field goes on in these statements to reveal many other details about Soviet espionage in the State Department, who else was involved, who reported to whom, what they did, when and how. And these details match the stories that Chambers and other defectors have told over the years, thus lending further support to Chambers. In fact, everything that Field says dovetails very nicely with the testimony that Hetty Massing gave at Hiss's second trial. Finally, and most powerfully, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, from time to time, very briefly, a few files of the old Soviet government and its secret services have been made public. They contain many documents referring to Hiss and/or Chambers as Soviet spies. Books have been written about these documents, and people who are real fans of the case like me argue about the translation and interpretation and meaning not only of individual documents and individual words in the documents, but in some cases, when we get a Russian version of the documents, the original, we argue about the meaning of individual letters in the Russian alphabet, and I will spare you all that. But unless all these documents are false and/or misleading, Hiss and Chambers spied together for the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And not only was Chambers the one telling the truth about what happened then, but Hiss continued spying for the Russians through the end of World War II. When he sat behind FDR at the Yalta Conference and was functioning at a very high level indeed, meeting daily with the Secretary of State after the war, Alger Hiss was a Soviet spy. Except among a tiny number of diehards, the Hiss-Chambers case is over in terms of who was telling the truth. In the end, Chambers' stories holds up, supported by a mass of independent evidence. And it seems to me that the Hiss side has three structural defects. First, Chambers has no motive to lie. Second, you have to write off as a coincidence the friendship between these two different men. And even the limited friendship to which Hiss admitted is inexplicable, except within the communist movement. And third, you have to come up with some explanation for Chambers' possession of the documents that's not so complicated that you burst out laughing. I think there are only two mysteries remaining. The first is, what did Hiss do for the Russians during the war years? And presumably at some date we'll know that. And second, to me, the great mystery is, what was Hiss thinking all those years? Why and when did he become a communist? When and why did he decide to spy for the Soviet Union, which is a whole nother trip from becoming a communist? Why didn't he jump off the Moscow Express, as the saying went, the way so many people did when the purge trials and the Nazi-Soviet pact happened, and it became clear that what was going on there had nothing to do with building a better world? What was Hiss thinking through the HUAC trials, the HUAC hearings and the trials, and his long life after? And this, I suppose, we will never know. I do offer two bits of expert speculation. It may be that Hiss was still a communist in 1949, perhaps till the day he died. When you consider how much and how long he lied, and how many innocent third parties he hurt, it's difficult, not impossible, but difficult to imagine someone acting badly on that scale just to cover up a youthful indiscretion or to try and salvage his career. You could better accept someone lying that much and hurting that many innocent people if he could tell himself, I'm not just doing this for selfish motives. I'm helping to build a better world. I'm serving a cause. In the long run, what I'm doing is going to help build a better world for all the damage I'm doing to innocent people in the short term. And this makes Hiss, in a sense, a man who gave his life for the cause in which he believed. The historian Gary Wills wrote in the 70s that Hiss's refusal to volunteer autobiography, his total denial of any communist activities, his hedged denials of Chambers' accusations until external evidence forced him to change his story, he said, makes sense if Hiss had more to hide than the Chambers documents. That is why I would not pay him the insult of believing him. I would rather think that he's been serving his own gods with hidden gallantry. It is only as a secret foe that he regains the integrity people have always sensed in him. Chambers, confirmed in so many other ways, would thus be confirmed in his belief that Hiss was still a communist in 1949, an enemy he could salute even as he tried to destroy him. For her part, the British essayist Rebecca West had some fascinating speculation about what was going through Hiss's mind early in the case in '48. She suspects logically, I think, that when Chambers defected from the spy ring in '38, the Russians did what's called a damage assessment survey. They learned from Hiss the last day on which Hiss had given Chambers documents. Let's say that's April 1st. And then they learned from the next link up the chain from Chambers, Colonel Buykov, the last day that Chambers had given him papers, and let's say that was March 28, and the Russians put two and two together and realized Chambers has the last batch of documents Hiss gave him. Then a question arises for the Soviets, do we tell Alger that Chambers has the goods on him? And Ms. West speculates they probably decided no point in doing that. Hiss might panic or dry up as a source. They probably lied to him and said, don't worry, Chambers doesn't have anything on you. Carry on. And she goes on speculating 10 years later, when Hiss knew he'd have to answer Chambers' charges before HUAC, Hiss probably got back in touch with them, if he hadn't been in touch with them all along, and said, I just want to make sure I remember what you told me 10 years ago. Chambers doesn't have anything on me, right? And they said, right, Alger. And he said, okay, it's just going to be my word against his. And Hiss decided to tough it out and deny everything. If this is what happened, Mrs. West wrote, can you imagine the feelings of Alger Hiss on November 18th, 1948, when his lawyer, William Marbury, told him that Chambers had produced the typed and handwritten documents at the deposition? She says, it is not easy to imagine the chill that must have stolen into Mr. Hiss's heart when he was told that Mr. Chambers had produced these papers, and he experienced in terrible public solitude the prime disadvantage of treachery, that the man who becomes a foreign agent has thrown off his loyalty to his own state, but the foreign nationals for whom he works have not thrown off their loyalty to their own state and will always sacrifice him to it. Next, a few final thoughts.